Okay, everybody, this is the first PowerPoint of our module number 3, which corresponds with week number 3. And during this week, we're going to be looking at the Haudenosaunee Confederation, or the League of Nations. You might know them better by the name Iroquois, which is the name that the French settlers gave to them, probably starting in the 1600s, 1700s, well before the Revolutionary War that resulted in the creation of the United States, separating from Great Britain. But we are going to refer to them as the name that they call themselves, and that is Haudenosaunee, and that translates to the people of the Longhouse. We're going to be going into a lot of their history and also their contemporary situation, but you should know that they were initially comprised of 5 separate nations: the Mohawk, the Seneca, Cayuga, Oneida, and Onondaga. The Onondagas are the fire keepers, or the heart of the Confederacy. But I think around 1722, the Tuscarora peoples came from the south and came to the protection of the Confederacy and have been part of the Confederacy since that time. So I like to start with this slide because I think it's kind of arresting. It sort of makes you stop and look, and then you look at the message underneath that. You're looking at the first draft of the United States Constitution. And when I show this slide, you know, some people know what that is that you're looking at, and some people are more taken by the words underneath it. But this is a wampum belt, and we're going to be talking about what wampum is and how the Haudenosaunee did and do continue to bring it into their ceremonies and such. But this is the Hiawatha Belt, and it is meant to portray the 5 nations. If you start on your right, that would be the Mohawk Nation. They are what's called the guardians of the Eastern Door. So from a geographical standpoint, they continue to be located, as they have historically for thousands of years, in what we now call the areas of New York, Pennsylvania, and parts of Canada, all the way up to the Grand River. Next to them, these are the Oneida Nation. This is where I spent my time when I was teaching in New York. I spent my time with the Oneida peoples. So they are just adjacent to the Mohawk Nation. If you move to the far left, that's the Guardians of the Western Door. That's the Seneca Nation. And next to them are the Cayuga peoples, or the Cayuga Nation. And in the center there, those are the Onondagas. And like I just mentioned, they are considered the heart of the Confederacy, and they're also called the fire keepers. When the nations come together for Grand Council, they always meet in Onondaga territory. And you know, the Taradajo, or one of the spiritual leaders of the Onondaga Nation, which has been passed down for, again, thousands of years, it resides within Onondaga territory. Now, why do I say this is the first draft of the Constitution? Another thing that we don't learn in our history books or during our high school history surveys and classes is that our founding fathers interacted with the sachems, the chiefs, if you will, of all of these Haudenosaunee nations extensively. Thomas Jefferson writes about the Haudenosaunee leaders. Benjamin Franklin attended many of their grand councils and learned from them, asked them questions, and wanted to learn as much as he possibly could about the way they conducted their government. And what we'll see is that they actually did inform our founding fathers about these ways that are democratic and ancient and rooted in egalitarianism and equality. So, you know, we think about the Greeks and the Romans as, especially the Greeks, as being the oldest democracy, but the Haudenosaunee peoples precede the Greeks even, again, by probably 500 to 700 years. They already had formed their confederacy, which was rooted in democratic ideals and values. So this is obviously not an exact parallel of these words, and you won't be tested on this, so don't feel like you have to memorize this. But Deganawada is probably one of the most important founding entities of the Haudenosaunee League or Confederacy. And this is what the people have passed down in the narrative form or the oral history about what he said. So I am Deganawada, and with the 5 nations Confederate lords, I plant the tree of the great peace. Roots have spread out from the tree, and the name of these roots is the great white roots of peace. If any man or any nation outside the 5 nations shall show a desire to obey the laws of the great peace, they may trace the roots to their source, and they shall be welcomed to take shelter beneath the tree. So these words are largely the reason why the Tuscarora, again, many centuries later in 1722, took that message seriously and came and joined the other 5 nations. So now it's the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee League or Confederacy. Now I want you to compare those words to what our founding fathers wrote. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, meaning those who come after us, do ordain and establish the Constitution for the United States of America. Anyone who's paying attention to the news right now knows that this Constitution is front and center in a lot of debates and a lot of interactions that are happening. So we kind of hold the Constitution as sacred in our society. And what we're going to discover during this week looking at the Haudenosaunee is we have good reason to, because a lot of the values and principles embedded in our United States Constitution came from the Haudenosaunee peoples. So in order for me to talk a little bit more at length about who they are, I'm going to start with the creation story. You've probably noticed by now that the creation story is not posted under module 3, and there's a good reason for that. I like to take versions of the creation story only from the people themselves, the Haudenosaunee peoples. A lot of anthropologists, historians, social scientists, et cetera, that are outside of the Haudenosaunee League have written their creation story and published that. They're not accurate. So I'm going to do my best here to retell you what I learned when I was living amongst the Haudenosaunee people about their creation story. So I'm going to start with a time incomprehensibly long ago when there was nothing that we would think of as the earth per se, only these kind of watery depths in which there were living relatives, living beings. So water, birds, the beings of the sea, all of that was here, but what we think of as humans had not come yet to inhabit this place. But there was a sky world, and in sky world, if you picture it, it looked a lot like what we see on our best days on Earth today. I mean, beautiful green rolling hills. Think about Billings in the springtime, right? Four-leggeds, winged ones, those that swim, beautiful green trees, flowers, all of that. But also there were two-leggeds like us, and the only difference between them and us is that they kind of had this very unique gift, and that was that they could bring things into existence just by thinking about them, right? So if they imagined a tranquility and peace, that's what happened, and that's where they were. And at the center of this sky world was a great tree. And the beings of Skyworld had been instructed, don't eat from this tree. This might sound a little familiar. Don't really bother with this tree. It's meant to hold the sky world together. It's a support. But there was one female of the sky world, and we're going to call her Sky Woman. I'm not going to make you remember the name that the Haudenosaunee call her. It's really long, beautiful, and obviously they hold her in very high esteem. But she did desire to drink tea from the leaves of the tree. And as she approached the tree, her partner, husband, whatever, was trying to help her, and he was trying to sort of move back some of the branches of this tree so she could get in there. As a result of this, part of the tree uprooted and caused a rupture between the sky world and these watery depths below. And Sky Woman, as she saw this rupture, she leaned forward to see what she could see down below, and it was all darkness and watery. And as she leaned more and more forward, she fell through this hole in the sky world, and she began to fall kind of out of control. You can think about yourself when you dream about it, or maybe some of you have skydived or whatever. She's kind of, tumbling head over heels, and she's falling, and towards something that she cannot see and she cannot sense. And so we can imagine kind of what a terrifying descent that was into the unknown. Little did she know, this descent was the first action of bringing this world into existence. But as she's falling and there's nothing to catch her, the water birds happen to look up and they see this being falling, plummeting towards the water. And so as one, they kind of rise in unison, and they form what you might think of as a net with their beautiful wings, right? Some people say they're swans, and swans are very important in Haudenosaunee and other indigenous cultures. Anyway, they form kind of a net between them, and as she falls, she lands kind of on this feathery softness. And slowly, they start to glide down lower and lower and take her closer and closer to the water below. But they're realizing she's not going to be able to live on water. And it's at this time that the great turtle rises from the depths and offers its back as a place for her to land. That's why we call North America Turtle Island, because Haudenosaunee and other people of the Northeast woodlands, the Huron, etc., they believe that this is where Sky Woman fell in what we now call North America. And you can find some indigenous kind of maps of how the turtle is kind of mapped out throughout North America. Anyway, they set her down very, very gently, and as she sits up and looks around, out of gratitude, she acknowledges each of the relatives that have saved her, really, but realizes that it's going to be a very short-lived experience if she doesn't have some way to live there. So one by one, the water mammals begin to realize they have to go down, dive down, and bring back some of the earth so that they can cover Turtle's back, so that she can make a life and make a way to live there. So otter, all of these loon, all of these different beings go down, and each one of them comes back up after a long time sputtering, and they were not successful. And finally beaver dives down, and is gone a very long time. And just as they're losing hope, the body of beaver kind of bobs up above the waves, and they realize that beaver sacrificed its life to bring back in its paws some of the earth from the watery depths. So they get busy and begin to spread it out, and Sky Woman stands up and begins to dance. There's actually a Haudenosaunee dance attributed to Sky Woman as she softly kind of spreads this earth all over the shell and the back of the turtle. Now, what she realizes as she was falling is that she's with child. So that was one of the reasons why her, this immediacy to get something growing and something happening was so important. And lo and behold, pretty soon she does give birth to a daughter. There are different names that the people call her. I'm going to go with one. They call her the Lynx or Lynx, and she is born from Sky Woman. And this is a very, very important relationship because the very foundation of the Haudenosaunee peoples is the mother-daughter relationship. So these nations or these peoples are one of the few that we can still say are matrilineal, meaning that they base everything through the woman's line. I know there are other communities, even here in what's now Montana, that also follow the mother's line in terms of clan. But this is one of the oldest, and everything centers around that mother-daughter relationship. So what's really interesting, and I'm just going to do a little aside here, when the founding fathers, well, I should say when the first explorers, but then, the first ships arrived with the Puritans and then the Pilgrims, and they began to make treaties or at least kind of enter into these encounters with the Haudenosaunee people. They didn't realize that the women had equal power. They only met the men as the men came out in their birch bark canoes to kind of converse with these new peoples. But what they didn't realize is that the clan mothers were the ones that were directing the sachems and the other male representatives to go out and greet these strangers. So the relationship between Sky Woman and her daughter is foundational, and they began to go around across Turtle Island and began to name the things that started to grow. So the very first things that were named on Earth were named according to this Haudenosaunee creation story by Sky Woman and Lynx. So this relationship, as it's been told throughout the millennia, centuries and centuries and centuries, was very, very close and very good. But eventually the north wind in the form of a man fell in love with Lynx, and she became pregnant as well. And as she carried the babies, they were two twins inside of her, and there was a lot of fighting between them. So, there was conflict from the very beginning of her carrying these two. When it came time for her to give birth, the first twin was born in the regular, or I guess, what we think of as the normal way, right? But, and he's usually called Sapling. The other twin ripped out of her side, basically, and caused her death. Now, I want to stop here, and I want to make sure that we don't equate this second twin, who we call Flint, with evil or bad, and Sapling with good. Because what the Haudenosaunee know and have known is that the whole earth, everything around us, is comprised and composed of opposite energies that are complementary, right? So if you just think about the changing of the seasons that we are witnessing, you know that we have to have the darkness and the cold of the winter in order for the spring to return, right? We have to have the darkest night in order to appreciate the dawn, etc. So, I used to teach Eastern religions. In Taoism, if you think about the yin yang principle and the symbol, that kind of embodies it as well. So Flint and Sapling became sort of what we might think of as these sort of creative forces as they went around the earth and began to, for example, Sapling would make these, high, majestic mountains, and then Flint would counteract by making these deep valleys, right? So they worked in opposition with each other. And there are many, many stories about them and about the way the earth was created. But as you can see, Sky Woman, was very, very sad about the loss of her daughter. And while she maintained a very close relationship with these twins, eventually when she died, she went back up to the sky, and the Haudenosaunee believed that the moon is Sky Woman, the earth being Lynx, the moon is Sky Woman. So that's basically how the creation of the earth happened. Again, rooted in this very strong mother-daughter relationship, ruled in matrilineality, meaning the succession follows the mother's line. And what do I mean by that? It means that if you grow up in your mother's clan, let's say you're part of the Mohawk Nation and your mother's part of the Wolf clan, you can find your partner in any of the nations, including Mohawk, as long as they're not the same clan. So you can't marry a person from the Seneca Nation who's also the Wolf clan, because your clans are like family. You can marry someone from the Mohawk Nation who's from the Turtle clan or the Eel clan or the Crane or the Beaver clan, but you don't intermarry amongst the clans. As the earth began to populate and more people began to live on the earth, inevitably there began to be some conflict. And so one, I guess we would say, this very eventful thing happened when Deganawada came to the people and basically said, we're too close in proximity. We have to separate. We have to go different directions. And he asked the people to take a hold of a vine and basically walk into the river and see where the river took them. But the vine snapped, and some of the people went to one of the banks of the river, and some of the people went to another bank of the river. And Deganawada said to them, basically to the women, I want you to go into the woods, and whatever is the first relative that you see, that will be your clan and the people who are with you, the clan. And so as you can see, there are all the different clans of the Haudenosaunee sort of represented here on the back of the turtle. And in the center there is the Great Tree of Peace, which if you haven't watched the legendary founding yet, it talks all about what the Great Tree of Peace is. So I'll let you view that to find out why that is so central to the Haudenosaunee League. Okay, so we know that we have Deganawada, who's kind of, I don't want to say necessarily supernatural, but kind of takes on this aura, this very sacred aura, as one of the leaders or one of the founders, basically, of the coming together of the nations. So again, during this time of conflict, there was a lot of warfare, there was a lot of violence, and there was a lot of bloodshed before the clan system kind of emerged. And at the center of that was a warlord, and he was the head, or the Taradaho, again, remember that term, of the Onondaga Nation, which later became the Firekeepers and the heart of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. But at this time, incomprehensibly long ago, he was not that. And he was kind of a rival and at war with the other peoples. So Deganawada saw this and began to try to go from one community to the next and talk about, living together peacefully. But he wasn't having a lot of luck until he crossed paths with Hiawatha. And you might have heard that name before. There's a great poem, the Song of Hiawatha, that's kind of written about him. But who was Hiawatha? Hiawatha was kind of a leader of one of these great communities that had been rising. But his conflict with Taradaho of the Onondaga Nation led to severe punishment and retribution by Taradaho, and also a sorcerer associated with Taradaho, who killed all of Hiawatha's daughters. And Hiawatha at this point was absolutely inconsolable and left his community and began wandering about, just kind of half crazed. You can think about how you might feel, or maybe some of you have experienced that kind of grief. You're so inconsolable, you're so wild with grief that you just you're not functioning, you don't even know where to go. And he comes to this lake, and he's literally thinking of just like plunging into the lake and ending it all. And as he's crying, he's like pushing away his tears and looking out, he notices that all the ducks on the middle of the lake are just rising up out of the water. And as they rise, the waters kind of part, and he sees these beautiful, sparkling, they look like jewels on the sort of bottom of the lake. And he begins to go and gather them. And these are the shells, or actually the shells of the quahog and the clams and the other living beings that live there. And he is able to kind of use these shells in a way that he starts stringing them together. And as he's stringing them together, the tears in his eyes, he's wiping away the tears, and he's opening up his ears so he can listen, and his throat is finally starting to open up. He's not just like staggered by the silence of grief. And so what he's doing here is he's stringing these shells together was then and is called the condolence ceremony, where the people come together in the time of a great loss or in the time of something very important, and they perform the condolence ceremony together to wipe the tears away so that you can see clearly, to open the ears so that you can hear clearly, and to open the throat so that you can speak good words of peace. So you're probably imagining now this union between Deganawada and Hiawatha sort of becomes symbolic of this message of peace that's going out to all the different communities that we know became these kind of rising nations organized by the clans. But the problem is Taradaho's not listening. And Taradaho, they say, was so wild with rage and violence that snakes instead of hair grew out of his head. And no matter what Deganawada and Hiawatha tried to do, he didn't want to listen to those words of peace, and he just kept up this sort of violent behavior. So they decide they're going to have to bring in the big guns in the form, guess what, of a woman, Jigonsase, who becomes the first clan mother. So many stories about her. They're so rich and so beautiful. Some people say that she lived at this crossroads where when people were going to fight each other, they'd be going this way and that way and crossing paths, and she lived there where these warring people would pass, always inviting them in, always trying to get them to, to commiserate over a meal, to talk about ways that they could get over their differences and their conflicts. And so Hiawatha and Deganawada approach Jigonsase and ask her for help. And they tell her, if you are able to convince Taradaho, you will become a clan mother. You will name the chiefs or the sachems of all the nations, right? And that's still what happens today. I was just at a conference in New York last year, and that's exactly what happens when a chief or a sachem dies. The clan mother of that particular group names the next chief. They do so much more than that too. They're responsible for calling the ceremonies. They watch all the young boys to see who has the right attributes to become a future sachem or chief. But Jigonsase, she approaches Taradaho, and she's speaking these words of peace. And as she gets closer and closer, she reaches out and begins to comb the snakes from his hair. That's, obviously a metaphor as well, but soothing him, right? And bringing down this anger and this hot-headedness and this rage. And he eventually listens to her and becomes part of this kind of peace vision. And because she did that, she becomes the clan mother. She places the antlers on the head of Taradaho. And you'll see all of that in the short documentary. So they have established the Great Law of Peace, and Deganawada and Hiawatha go to the center of what's now the Onondaga Nation, and they uproot a great white pine and instruct all the warriors to throw their weapons into the cavity, and then they replant this tree. And basically the roots, as we mentioned before, spread out into all different directions of Turtle Island. And to this day, the Haudenosaunee say, if you understand their words of peace, their law of peace, you can join their league and their confederacy as well. Okay, so again, the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse. That's kind of how they see themselves. Their traditional domicile is actually a log house, a longhouse made of logs. You can see all of this if you look at any sort of historical references. And their ceremonies are still carried out in the longhouse. And many people still live traditionally in the longhouse. But I also like it because it looks like a longhouse geographically, you know, kind of cartographically, map-wise. You can sort of see the eastern entrance to the longhouse is the Mohawks, the western entrance is the Seneca. If you have business with any of the nations, you have to enter through one of those two doors or entrances. So that's what they call themselves. Now, what's the connection with our founding fathers? Well, in 1794, George Washington commissioned that this wampum belt be made, which is the George Washington belt. But what you can see is that they are linking arms together. This is based on and rooted in the Haudenosaunee understanding of being together. And they use the symbols of arrows. Like if you have one arrow, you can break it. But if you have many arrows together, they're unbreakable. And so they were using at the time their 6 nations as an example of 6 arrows together. But as you can see, this represents the 13 colonies of the original colonies, and the Haudenosaunee lesson of, you know, in unity there is strength. And in the middle there, it's some people say that's a longhouse. Some people say it stands for the White House. Other people say it can be both, right? But this very first belt that was commissioned by George Washington really represented linking arms together, the very foundation of what a treaty means. Also, the Great Seal of the United States has many, many symbols that are associated with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, including the eagle, right, who sits at the top of the tree of peace, but also there in its, what would that be, the eagle's left talon on our right side, are the arrows together, and in unity there is strength. Also, Thomas Jefferson, when writing the Declaration of Independence, was going to include life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, but he changed it to the pursuit of happiness. And in his own writings, you can find the influence that the Haudenosaunee peoples had on him. So he changed that as a result of his interactions. So this is kind of the original Haudenosaunee symbol of that strength that is found in the unity, unbreakable. So they are the oldest and longest functioning democracy, as I mentioned. They feature shared power. There's a balance of power. I already said that the women have equal power, but every single voice is heard, especially in the Grand Council. We're going to get into how the Grand Councils are run very democratically, and in the middle, obviously, is the fire. So they come together at Grand Council. Mohawks and Senecas are considered the oldest siblings of the family, basically, and so the issues that are passed back and forth go from the Mohawk and then eventually to the Seneca and finally to the Onondaga. The Cayuga and the Oneida have voting power, and they have to come to consensus. That's the heart of the Grand Council. Nothing is resolved until there's consensus, which is the sign of a true democracy. Women's suffrage or women voting. It's so funny when I hear, I mean, no disrespect, honestly, but you know, when we look at that kind of the early feminists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, etc., we think, oh my gosh, thank goodness they were the first ones to get the right of women to vote. But no, I mean, the Haudenosaunee women had voting rights long, long before European American women did. And actually, Matilda Gage writes about that. She was actually adopted into one of the Haudenosaunee nations. She's an early feminist, and she talked about the influence that those women had on her. The leaders are understood to be servants of the people, not monarchs. They're not above. They don't have more power. They are servants of the people and serve the will of the people. This is one of the wampum belts that shows, it's called the circle wampum, and this really represents the Grand Council, where you have 50 chiefs, you have 50 clan mothers advising and sitting with the chiefs, but that longest wampum string there, it represents the people, and that's meant to show that the people together have the strongest voice in the circle of the Grand Council. We also know that in 1744, an Onondaga Sachem, Knessetego, actually went to one of the councils where Benjamin Franklin was present, and I don't want to say taught him, but basically described to him how the Grand Councils functioned and how they were egalitarian and equal in nature. And Benjamin Franklin brought that information back to the people that were coming together to write the Articles of Confederation, etc., brought those principles back. So Knessetego in 1744 was very informative about those principles. In 1753, Benjamin Franklin actually wrote about that and attended one of the Grand Councils at Onondaga. If any of you are familiar with Poor Richard's Almanac, those are kind of his musings or writings or diaries, if you will, where he describes the influence of the Haudenosaunee at great length. Now, of course, it's important to remember, not the women so much, right? Because these were European American men, right? They had a different system of how they did gender stuff. So they didn't write a lot about the influence of women, although we do have an account during the Revolutionary War of clan mothers refusing to let General Schuyler, who was the father-in-law of Alexander Hamilton, take his troops through a part of Pennsylvania where they were cultivating their fields. And they refused to let that happen, told the men to pass that on to Schuyler, and he went a different route. So there are all these accounts. If you're interested in those, let me know. Have them all in my office on campus. At the 1754 Albany Congress, or the Plan of Union, you can see that there were indigenous, aka Haudenosaunee and Huron representatives there to witness, but also to counsel and advise. And of course, the 1773 Boston Tea Party, where the colonists rose up against England and threw the tea back into the harbor, saying no taxation without representation. And I don't know about you guys, but I learned in history that, they dressed up like Haudenosaunee, well, they said Iroquois people as, kind of in a clownish or buffoon way. But no, they were actually dressing in the garb of the indigenous peoples to demonstrate that they were more committed to the principles of the indigenous peoples of the Northeast than they were the principles of King George and the British. So they were really like wearing that on their bodies. The journals of the Continental Congress reflect many of the principles of the Haudenosaunee. So somewhere between 1777 and 1789, we have the Articles of the Confederation becoming what we now know of as the United States Constitution, including, the amendments of the Bill of Rights, the first 10. So I'll end where I began. The wampum belt, the Hiawatha belt, is the first sort of example of how the United States Constitution came to be. We'll be talking more about it. I wish I was in a classroom with you. We could really sort of get into a better discussion about it, but you will be in the discussion forum on Canvas, and I look forward to what you have to say. Thank you.